Dear Lord, may the words of my mouth and meditations upon all of our hearts be holy and acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Back in college, I had an opportunity to spend a summer in Germany. During the week, I was studying the German language in Munich, and on the weekends, I would travel through the country as an American tourist. One thing I learned about Germany that was on the weekends, things slowed down, especially on Sundays. Things have relaxed a bit since then, but Germany still has some of the most strict laws in Europe for businesses related to their opening hours. Now, some of you might remember the blue laws. Remember those here in the United States? A couple decades ago, it was hard to find anything open on a Sunday. Whole communities would shut down for Sundays. However, that's long in the past. Our culture has become more frenetic, hectic, busier. We are on the move 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But Germany held on to those old ways. I remember one Sunday afternoon spending time with a German friend. We were enjoying the day walking through the downtown of a quaint village. We weren't the only ones. It seemed as if the entire village had decided to gather in the town center. Families with strollers were walking the streets. Couples held hands as they walked. Not a single shop was open, yet the streets were full. And I turned to my friend and I said, they could make a ton of money if those shops were open today. And my friend laughed and said, "You are such an American." Guilty as charged. I am an American through and through. We are a nation of strivers, always looking for an opportunity or an opening. We are overachievers. We won World War II and the Cold War and found time to put a man on the moon. We are a nation of the supersize and the dollar menu. As Americans, we know how to hustle. And it's right there in our founding documents. Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The pursuit. We say that there's no right to happiness itself, but we're not going to get in your way and we're going to let you pursue it. Now, the founding fathers did have some thoughts on what happiness is, but we modern Americans can't be bothered with that. We flitter about as a moth attracted to a flame. We are tirelessly in search of happiness, however we define it. Unfortunately, in the process, we often get burned. One reason that I love the story of Jacob is that he is us. Long before there was an America, Jacob was the quintessential American. He has always been in pursuit of his own happiness. And now Jacob also was known to cut a few corners along the way. His pursuit sometimes led him to engage in some questionable activities. But despite being a scoundrel, I find that I can identify with this man. Now, Jacob was born with a promise. His mother knew he was destined for great things, which the two of them used as an excuse for some bad behavior. Jacob took advantage of his brother's self-satisfaction to gain the older brother's birthright. He tricked his father to receive the family blessing. Jacob wanted to be head of the family. He wanted his flocks and cattle to be his. He wanted the servants and the slaves. But his pursuit of his own happiness so ticked off his brother that Jacob found himself on the run. Now, last week we discovered that God has something in mind for this trickster. He gives Jacob a vision of a stairway to heaven, but Jacob can't seem to move beyond himself. He treats God's promise as a pursuit. He promises sacrifice and obedience only after God holds up his end of the bargain. Jacob treats God as a transaction, not a relationship. But this week we find Jacob at the home of Laban. Jacob's mom has sent him in that direction. She thought the boy could find a wife there in that household and lay low for a while. And then Jacob could maybe come back when things have cooled down a little bit with the family. However, when Jacob meets Laban, he meets his match. Apparently, it runs in the family. Laban is as much a scoundrel as his nephew. And under Laban's tutelage, Jacob learns that his pursuit never quite leads to happiness. The story of Jacob and Rachel is actually literally the very first love story in the Bible, right there in the middle of the book of Genesis. They meet at a well, and according to the Bible, Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful, and Jacob was smitten. He does the hard work for providing water for the flocks that she's caring for, and when Laban gets word of this, he decides to cut a deal with Jacob. Work for me for 7 years, and she's all yours. And the Bible tells us that for Jacob, that time was just a few days because he loved Rachel so much. Can you imagine Jacob for 7 years working, but longing for his future wife, trying to catch a glimpse of her, planning his future life with her? Well, then finally the wedding day comes. And then the wedding night. Jacob discovers that Laban has switched the brides. Instead of marrying Rachel, Jacob actually marries Rachel's sister, Leah. Jacob's livid. He goes to Laban demanding an explanation. Laban suggests, Leah is the older sister, and usually in our neck of the woods, we marry off the older sister before we marry off the younger sister. So, I'm willing to cut another deal with you, Laban says. You can take Rachel as your second wife if you promise to work for me for 7 more years. Just like Jacob's other pursuits for happiness, this one doesn't seem to work for him exactly either. Now, gratefully, many of us, most of us, I don't think any of us have been in Jacob's situation. However, I would argue that anyone who's been married understands Jacob. Someday, you're going to wake up, you're going to roll over, and you're going to look at your spouse sleeping there, and at that very moment, you'll say to yourself, is this the same woman that I thought I was marrying? Is this the guy with whom I was so infatuated? Has there been some sort of invasion of the body snatchers? Did I really marry the right guy and gal? Yeah, we understand Jacob. We understand what he's going through. Did you know that lawyers say that 30 to 40% of all divorces involve Facebook? Did you know that? When someone's pursuit of happiness doesn't lead to marital bliss, it is easy to go looking for your old lovers on a social media site. Our desires for elusive happiness leads us to drop one person and pursue another. If you are currently cultivating a relationship online, or for that matter in real life, that would embarrass you if your spouse found out about it, stop it. Or if you're so disappointed that your marriage doesn't fit your expectation, get some help. There is help out there. Talk to your pastor, talk to a counselor, get some help. It's interesting how our pursuits often disappoint us. When I was in Africa on a mission trip, I had an opportunity to talk to some of the locals about polygamy. It was interesting to hear the difference of the responses between men and women about polygamy. The men said, the morality of polygamy, it's a complicated question here. Sometimes the wives become as close as sisters, and it'd be very difficult to be able to sort through all that for a man to make a choice between those two wives. And then we talked to the women. And the women said, multiple wives in a marriage doesn't work. The wives become jealous of each other. They become vicious to each other. There is never ending any peace whatsoever. Isn't it fascinating that the men would see it in a much better light than the women? And this was the situation in Jacob's household. Leah and Rachel, sisters, end up despising each other. The children that are conceived in that marriage, they're just conceived out of spite. They want to one-up each other on the amount of kids that they have. In fact, they're giving like servant girls to Jacob to have kids with them so that they can up their totals. It's notable that if you read through the chapter there, Jacob, it is the women who give the names to the children. Jacob never does. It's almost as if Jacob wants to stay completely out of the situation. He stepped back. This is an incredibly dysfunctional family. So what does Jacob do? Well, he does what many of us do when things aren't going well at home. He throws himself into his work. He begins to amass a fortune in animals, all at the expense of Laban. Jacob suggests to Laban, he says, I'll take as my wages for my work, I will take the spotted lambs, the lambs with speckles. And you can have the lambs without spots or without speckles. And then Jacob decides to do some creative breeding and ensures that the overwhelming majority of all the sheep have speckles and spots. As Laban tricked Jacob, now Jacob is tricking Laban. And the sons of Laban are pretty mad. They get mad that Jacob has deceived their father. In fact, Laban also gets pretty ticked off as well. Another pursuit for Jacob's happiness has turned sour. There are many people who try to find happiness in their careers. We have often a sense of identity wrapped up in our careers. When you meet somebody, the first thing you say, well, what's your name? Next question is, what do you do for a living, right? We are so tied to our understanding of work that it's a part of us. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but there will be a time in life where our work, our jobs, our careers are not going to be able to provide us success or happiness. I've met too many older people who find themselves out of a job at the age of 60. Others who can do the job cheaper, or the economy has eliminated the position. They're too young to retire, too old to be hired by somebody else. When that happens, you can see the desperation, you can see the pain and the sorrow, because who am I? If I don't have a job, if I don't have work, who am I? What am I good for? What am I worth? When I'm pursuing this, what happens when I don't find the happiness that I am seeking? Family and career, these are probably the two greatest pursuits of happiness in our lives that we seek out. Ultimately, I would argue that they aren't enough. We soon discover that our happiness does not come from our pursuits. Happiness, or perhaps better described as our joy or our comfort in life, does not come from our achievements. We must learn that these are a blessing. It's a gift of God. Our identity, our meaning, our satisfaction comes directly by the grace of God. Jacob keeps looking for schemes and hustles to change his fortune, and in the end, he actually makes his situation worse each time. But by leaning on God's blessings, we can weather the storms. Like the illustration for the children, that engine goes in the front of the train. Everything else follows: our careers, our relationships, our families. It's here at this table. We are reminded that it is Christ who sustains us. Christ becomes for us broken bread. Christ becomes for us poured out wine. As food sustains our bodies, Christ sustains us, first and foremost. And if we keep that first and foremost in our lives, then we can consider the harder questions. What do I do about my career? What do I do about my relationships? What about my family? These things drive us and keep us to be able to actually focus on true happiness and what it's all about. Jacob takes a while to learn, but he's coming along. He's seeing the alternatives. But next week, he is going to come face to face with God. Join us next week for that. Amen.